Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and music production. This is lesson 4.02, and in this lesson we're going to talk about using the effect tracks so that we can implement a little bit of parallel processing. So we've already talked about parallel processing and we've really kind of dug into the nuts and bolts already, but just as a recap for some of you guys, if you've already forgotten, parallel processing is basically just taking an audio signal, whether that's an instrument or it's a drum loop or it's anything, and duplicating that out or figuring out a way where we can send the audio somewhere else so that we have independent control over the same signal. Okay, and just to actually give you guys a simple example of that, if we go in and just grab a random loop, let's change the tempo down to like 80. Play that back. If for some reason I was to put reverb on here, all right, I like the sound of that. It's all well and good, but I can never get my original back. It's now being processed in some way. And yes, there's a mix, but unless my mix is at 0, I'm always like permanently impacting the signal. The solution to that is very simple. We'll duplicate the track out, and now on this first one, we'll turn the reverb off. So now we just have this dry signal here. And now in my processed version, I can crank that up to 100%. And what we're going to have is now a mixture. And I can mix that into taste. And hopefully you guys have gone off and done a lot of experimenting already, seeing what does and maybe doesn't work every time. And that brings me to my next point, which is you're going to find a lot of videos out there that are very specific about how to use some of these things like parallel processing. I'm not going to show you, for example, how to parallel process your bass sound to make it, pop and to make it super competitive and sound richer than everybody else. There's so many videos out there that do that. And if you want to do that, feel free to check those out. My goal here is to really just show you guys the underlying concept. And so if you want, you can actually break the mold and go beyond just, following exactly what somebody does, because although that might get you the results you're looking for, you're going to sound just like everybody else. But personally, I understand that there's a healthy balance. If you're really into a particular genre or style of music, feel free to search out those videos. But unless you guys have very specific questions, I'm probably not going to go that particular route. All right, cool. So let's talk about the effect tracks now. And the effect tracks in Bitwig Studio are very similar to what you're going to find in any other digital audio workstation. Some of them are going to call it aux tracks. Others are going to call it send and return. And either way, they do the same thing. And the effect track is designed to do a very specific purpose. You can actually mold this and make it do other things, which I'll talk about towards the end of this lesson. But for now, let's think about how you're going to use this in a more traditional way. So parallel processing is all well and good, but people started to get really tired of having to make tons and tons of duplications if they wanted to implement parallel processing. So what you have in the digital audio workstation is the ability to route multiple pieces of audio into one track. Okay, and you have control over the level of those. And then on that track, you can actually put on various effects. And before computers got so powerful, you really couldn't stand to make 5 duplications and have a bunch of different effects. Your computer just would crash. And the first solution was to bounce. And we showed that in the last video, where after I did my changes, I bounced those down and then just mixed in the levels. Computers started to get more and more powerful, and so then people could start to use this send and return structure. So if, for example, you had 18 different tracks and you all wanted to give them reverb and you want it to be the same reverb, great solution, right? You can just route everything in there. And I'll just quickly show you guys that. So let's rename this to A, and let's make a new audio track, and we're going to rename that to B. And the cool thing about Bitwig is that if you actually click on the effect, and let's call this reverb for right now, you can see that we have these little sliders in here that actually are going to control the amount of send level that we want going into this reverb, which is then going to output signal to the master. So what I can do is I can grab something else for B. Let's see, what do we got? That works for me. Let's just speed this up a little bit, make sure it sounds okay. All right, cool. So notice what happens now if I take my A track and I turn the send level up. This is going to be available to you in a few different places. If you're on the mix view, you have your send knobs right here. If you're in the arrange view, you have your send knob over here. And then again, obviously, if you actually click on the effect track itself, you can control the sends with these cute little sliders, like so. So let's send some of A and hear what happens. All right, so hopefully what you're hearing is that our A track, our little African bass, is just being raised in level. And instantly you should be thinking, parallel processing time, right? If I solo out this reverb track, we're just getting that clean bass sound. It's like the same thing as duplicating this guy. And if I want to then add in a little bit of the drums, you can see that here. Right, super, super cool. And just as a reminder on these pre and post, if I set this to pre, it turns blue, and now it's no longer dependent on this slider. So I could actually even mute the track, and we'd still hear it coming through. Let me just turn this one down so you guys can hear it. Or I guess it won't let me mute the track because that's before the fader in the signal process, but you can tell that I've turned it all the way down now, and we can still hear it. This is coming through the reverb channel. It's not coming through this A. Compare that to post, where if I switch this to post, it's actually going to take into account this fader, and so we're going to hear nothing unless I start to turn it up, and then we hear it. Most of the time you're going to be using post, but there are a lot of good uses for using pre, and we might talk about some of those towards the end of the video. All right, cool. One quick caveat though I need to point out right away is that when you are sending and you're working in this kind of a fashion, if I put an effect here on A, if I put my filter or something on here and I click play, again, we're just hearing the send level. We're just hearing this reverb track right now. Big issue, right? We're no longer getting that clean parallel chain. So do be aware of that. If you are sending after you've already made tons of effect moves, those effect moves are going to carry over regardless of if I go in pre or post. All right, just something to be aware of. And so oftentimes in some people's sets, especially for performing live, people will do this. They'll have a ton of different effect tracks, and then they'll keep everything else totally clean, the actual tracks where they're launching from. Anyway, this now should all seem pretty simple to you guys. If I want to do some parallel work here, all I have to do is drop the effect I want into my effect track. Maybe I want a little bit on the drums. And now that's without any reverb, without any parallel processing. And then with it. All right, so we can make as many of these effect tracks as we want, and then we can determine how much we want to send to those. So one other quick example here, this is something I've seen a lot of people do. We could actually probably do some hardcore compression on both of these if we want. So one thing I realized, the difference between the dynamics and the compressor, is the attack time. So if we have the compressor here, the lowest attack time we can set is 0.2 milliseconds. On our dynamics, we can actually go down to 0.1. And so for the example of parallel processing and parallel compression, you're probably going to want to use the dynamics advice, because you can even try to catch those peaks in the signal, which you may not be able to do with the compressor with a 0.2 attack time. So here we go. Let's try to set this guy up. What I'll do is I'll send both of these 100%. And now I'm just going to solo this dynamics, and I'm going to try to get the sound I want on here. I always do like, no matter when I set a compressor, I like to know that at some point it is having time to reset. And you're usually going to do that with the release knob there. Now I can turn this up. So you can really hear how those levels have really evened out. We're really squashing this pretty hard, and we could even do it a little bit harder if we wanted to for the sake of it. And again, experiment with using peak, RMS, changing your attack release times, changing the knee maybe a little bit. Whatever you want to do, give it a go. So now I can mix that in as well. Okay, very cool. And one last little thing I want to show you guys, which I've seen a few people doing recently. People have been doing this for a long time, but for some reason this has been a technique that's kind of come back, is you can always use multiple instances of like a dynamics or a compressor, whether that's on a track itself or within this send and return structure. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add another dynamics, only this one I'm going to use as a sidechain just for fun. And let's find a kick drum. This is the fun part about getting to watch me work from scratch, is that you get to watch me scroll through all these menus. Hopefully you have something you can do for a couple minutes. And here we go. You can watch how when I work, I am incredibly slow. I'm never efficient at all. Here we go. In case you're wondering, I'm just holding down Option to do this stuff, to make these duplicates. Okay, cool. Okay, now what I'm actually going to do with this dynamics is, remember, this signal is very squashed, so we're getting a pretty even dynamic range all the way across. So what I want to do is I actually want to have this track kind of side chaining out when these kicks are hitting. All right, and so it's going to side chain like everything, which is really cool. It's not just going to side chain the African bass. It's not just going to side chain the Dolac. It's going to get both of those guys at the same time and even out our levels a little bit. So for my device input, I'm going to choose the kick. In this case, we'll work pre-fader. Why not? And let's see if we can get some sidechain action going on. Okay, so listen closely. Off. Listen to how the kick punches through here. Little glitch. So that's really, really cool. And if you ever want to, you can actually just make a dedicated sidechain inside here with your effect tracks. All right, and that's really, really a cool thing. The one frustrating thing about Bitwig is that it doesn't seem like you can actually send from effect track to effect track. So what I would probably want to do is have the ability to send my S2 dynamics like into a dedicated effect track for sidechaining. But as of right now, we can't necessarily do that unless I actually route the audio from here into another audio track somewhere else and then send that. So for example, I could maybe, let's see if we can actually do this. I may not even be able to do this. If this is going over your head, feel free to just ask a question in the comments. What I'm going to try to do is route this. Yeah, it's not going to let me do that. But it would have been interesting if I could have. All right, so the last thing I wanted to point out about Bitwig, and this is something you got to be very, very aware of as you move forward, is that they want this program to be incredibly user-friendly and incredibly flexible. And that's great and all if you're very experienced and understand where things normally are supposed to go. But if you're just starting out, you can sometimes run into some problems, and I'm going to explain that to you right now. I think by the time we get to Bitwig version 2 or 3, a lot of these little glitches and nuances will be ironed out. But for right now, you could run into a problem. So on this dynamics, if I wanted to, I could actually take an instrument. Okay, let's go in here and find an instrument. Let's use the organ. If I take this organ and I drop it on this dynamics, all right, I have my organ. But now what's happening when I play this back? Uh-oh. Right? We're no longer getting any send level. It's now assuming that the organ is an instrument and it is what's going to be affected by these two additional plugins here. So it's kind of weird because if I wanted to, I should be able to, if I was to spend a little bit extra time, I would actually be able to program in MIDI notes here. And if I did that, you'd be able to hear them and they'd be coming from the organ. Now, that's very different because nowhere else are you going to find a program that lets you drop instruments onto effect tracks. Mainly because if you do that, you're going to lose the ability to send your tracks through them. All right, so I want you guys to be aware of that. Now, if I go back and play it, all right, all is good. Same thing here with like our instrument tracks. I'm not sure if I've shown you guys this before, but if I wanted to, I could load in the organ. We could hit record here. And okay, so that wasn't perfect, but life isn't perfect either. Okay, now where this starts to get a little bit crazy is if I wanted to, I could actually go in here. And I could cut this out. And now where Bitwig is really flexible is if I wanted to, I could go find a piece of audio. I don't know what I'm going to use here. Okay, hopefully you guys saw what happened when I dropped that in. What happened is this converted from being an instrument track into what's known as a hybrid track. So I have both the audio signal and the audio and the instrument picture showing up here. And if I wanted, I could now just go in here and cut out just a small part. maybe we want to send this to the reverb as well. That to the dynamic stuff. Okay, so I mean, the crazy thing is, I love the flexibility in the program. I think it's really cool. But if you are just starting out, you need to be aware that there are some things that you can do in this program that will cause other things to stop working. And you saw that when I dropped the organ here onto the effect track. Okay, it is possible to do it. It's possible to program in MIDI notes. It's even possible to use one of these as a hybrid track. But for right now, and as we're moving forward, I want you to try and kind of work in a logical fashion. Okay, at least for now. And I think what we've set up here is pretty logical. So thank you so much for watching. And in the next video, we'll talk about one more way we can set up a little bit of parallel processing. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.